I'm Joseph Schwartz, and I'm here in Colorado, and it is a balmy 29 degrees today. I'm here to talk about the 5 primary kinetic chains. More specifically, I want to talk about the 5 principal actions that I have used to define the movement integration of these 5 primary kinetic chains. The 5 primary kinetic chains are based on Audrey Fleming's core subsystem postulation, which is basically this. There are these 5 principal, I'm going to use the word force transmission systems, that act on the lumbar pelvis region to create stability. Hey, Jonathan, welcome. These regions have a common theme. All 5 of these core system activations act on the sacroiliac joint, which is the base and the support for the spinal column. There are these 5 different subsystems, and each have a unique way that they act on the sacrum. And I call these the principal actions. Now, there's something that is unique about these principal actions, is that while we've depicted them in the walking gait, because the walking gait is I call it the universal translator. And why is that? Because all of our developmental movement is related to being biped, having the ability to walk and to evade predators, which is to be able to run away or to hunt. That's how our nervous system was designed, so that we can gain these skill sets very quickly. That's what developmental movement is all about. So these 5 fundamental actions or principles are what our movement, no matter what the movement is. But for the gait, it's very easily to utilize the gait, because everybody, unless they are physically challenged, everybody walks. It's part of the initiation of our human experience is to walk. We celebrate when our children first learn to walk. And so there's these 5 principles. 3 of them are what define what I call the dynamic platform. And that is how our breath is acting on our structure, how our structure is relating to the combination of gravity and shock absorption. The energy that is created from motility, from locomotion, from movement, has to translate through the structure. And the structure has to meet that. And that's what we call ground force reaction. Ground force reaction becomes the stability needed so that our axial skeleton can respond to the action of our appendicular skeleton. The action of the appendicular skeleton becomes the last 2 principal actions, which is the storing and releasing of elastic energy. This is work production. Elastic energy becomes how our work production becomes more efficient. So if we just start one by one here, we can see the intrinsic kinetic chain, And then on the charts, we have the core subsystems. So on the intrinsic core subsystem, we have the thoracic and pelvic diaphragms. We also have the transverse abdominis and the multifidus. Now, very interestingly, these all work in synergists and functional opposites. What I mean by that is, while the diaphragms move together in sync, they are moving in an opposite way. They are actually functional opposites. So when the thoracic diaphragm is moving downward, it is in its concentric phase. That's the inhalation phase of the breath. It's creating intra-abdominal pressure. That intra-abdominal pressure is acting on the pelvic floor. The pelvic floor is moving downward as well, but as it's moving downward, it is eccentrically lengthening. So there are functional opposites, even though they are moving together. During the inhalation phase, the multifidus is the synergist for the thoracic diaphragm. The thoracic diaphragm is part of the extension phase. So when we take an inhalation, our natural movement should be extension and external rotation. And then on our exhalation phase, the thoracic diaphragm is moving up and it is eccentrically lengthening. And our transverse abdominis is active, paired with the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor and the transverse abdominis are synergists. They work together synergistically. When one is in concentric action, the other is in concentric action, and vice versa with the thoracic diaphragm and the multifidus. Now, very interestingly, so this subsystem is creating intra-abdominal pressure. So as the intra-abdominal pressure goes up on the inhalation phase, the intrathoracic pressure goes down. That is how the sponges of the lungs take in oxygen. It's that decrease in pressure where then atmospheric pressure comes in and fills the void. So our first principal action is breath and breathing. Now, breath and breathing is also related to our central nervous system. How our autonomic nervous system is responding to movement. If that movement is integrated and the thresholds are beyond or thresholds have yet not to attain a level of a response where the nervous system has to cycle up to that sympathetic state, it remains in the parasympathetic state. Once our movement decreases in integration, where there is non-integrated components that come in, our nervous system will respond with a sympathetic response. Fortunately, this is measurable. And this is actually the foundation of dynamic neuromuscular assessment, is looking at this relationship of movement compared to how the nervous system is responding to that movement. So the principal action I say is we can't own our movement, or we can't own our breath until we own our movement. And that's this relationship of how the nervous system is responding to movement. When we start to look at the next 4 kinetic chains, these are the 4 fundamental phases of the gait. There are actually 9 phases, but I'm just breaking them down into 4 of the phases, which is strike, stance, push, swing. So the strike phase is how we're moving from the swing phase and we're engaging the ground engagement. This is where we've got, I'm getting my book out. This is where we've got our ground. In the walking gait, we heel strike or mid-foot strike. In the running gait, we transition from a heel mid-foot to a forefoot strike. Some people do heel strike in the running gait. That's not ideal because it creates excessive impact loads. So as we're walking, we have a combination of forward motion, which is kinetic energy, and we're interacting with gravity. Gravity is pushing the structure down. The forward motion is creating an impact load. This impact load has to move up the structure, and that's what this subsystem is. It moves through the calcaneus, through the talus, through the fibula-tibula complex of the ankle, and up the fibula. Through the fibula, through the knee, through the hamstrings, which are eccentrically responding. The hamstrings are lengthening during the strike phase. Then, as the motion, as the movement or the energy transitions up, it transitions through the sacrotuberous ligament into the SI joint. When it enters the SI joint, the energy crosses over the sacrum to the opposite side. And so we have a combination of functions that are happening here. Has to have the capacity to move up joint by joint. If one joint is unable to respond appropriately, that energy is going to get stuck. And this is what we have. This is what we see when people have compressed joints. Like you see a knee joint that doesn't respond, or an ankle joint that doesn't respond, or a hip joint that doesn't respond, or a sacroiliac joint that doesn't respond, or a lumbar joint that doesn't respond. And the musculature around that joint capsule will start to contract and compress that joint because the nervous system knows it's not safe to move. And because it's not safe to move, it's got to do something with that energy, and it tries to block it. It's like a dam and of energy where that blockage of energy gets stuck, and the body then has to hang on to it more and more. And so the more that we increase our load, the more activation our muscular skeleton has to take to protect ourselves from that load. And so it becomes, the dog chasing its tail, really. When we start looking at joint response, there are mechanoreceptors in the joint capsule and in the ligaments that are informing our cerebellum, part of the motor control center in the brain. Our cerebellum is part of the non-felt sense of motor control. We actually don't have to think about movement. Movement occurs on its own. We don't have to think about activating specific musculature unless we're trying to integrate our movement very specifically where we're learning a new movement. In that cognitive phase of learning, yes, we do have to think about it. But walking, we don't think about all the muscular actions of walking. Now, if we look at the kinetic chain charts, these are all the muscle actions. It's our ligament and joint response that's informing these muscle actions. These muscle actions then become the diagnostic tool to look at how joints and ligaments are responding to the various loads and stress during movement. One of the things that I see very common in my practice is the relationship between the inversion and eversion capacity of the calcaneus to the rotary component of the fibula. If the fibula is not able to respond with the rotary component from the relationship of supination, pronation, resupination, the kinetic energy from the strike phase is going to get stuck somewhere. It'll get stuck in the ankle, it'll get stuck in the knee, it'll get stuck in the hip, it'll get stuck in the SI joint. It'll even get stuck in the lumbar. It can travel all the way up to the thoracic and the cervical, all of it. Something very interesting has to happen here. We have this energy that has entered our body. Our body needs to respond to that energy. That response is called ground force reaction. And that becomes the fundamental element of the next kinetic chain, which is the lateral kinetic chain. Now, in the lateral kinetic chain, what we have is multiple things that are happening. One is the relationship of absorbing energy from the strike phase and translating that into leg drive so that we can stand into our stance phase of the gait. The second thing, and this is how the subsystem is acting, is how our pelvis is able to stabilize from going from a rotary action to the counter rotary action, from strike to stance to push. So there's always this action of the pelvis as the pelvis is rotating. And that's where our core subsystem is. Now, the core subsystem is oriented primarily for this coronal plane stability. This stability is what's providing a platform as the muscular action acts through the sacroiliac joint. It provides this platform for the axial skeleton, for the spinal column. When we look at the adductor, the abductor on the same side, that coactivation, it's coupled with the opposite QL. This creates this frontal plane stability of the pelvis. Now, the pelvis also needs to have stability in the sagittal plane, which would be flexion, extension, and it also needs to have rotary plane, which is the transverse plane. And so when we start to look at how the function of the lumbar is in relationship to the pelvis, we need to look at it in all three planes of motion, because that is going to set up the platform for the spine. Without that platform in place, the spine is going to have to be coping for the instability at the pelvis rather than being able to utilize its active capacity to stabilize for the appendicular skeleton. Now, in compensatory patterns, we'll see that there are two basic kinds of patterns that happen in relationship to the axial skeleton. One pattern is we will brace at the core for instability at the extremity. The other pattern is we will brace at the extremity for instability at the core. What does that really mean? So when you have your clients that come in that have distal injuries, it's because the core is not doing its job and the body is trying to recruit these distal joints to stabilize. For example, people that have rotator cuff injuries, more times than not, it's because the scapula doesn't have capacity to dynamically move with the structure, and the rotator cuff is trying to stabilize for the scapula. These first three principles, which is our breath and movement, the relationship of shock absorption and ground force reaction, our ability to have dynamic stability through the axial skeleton, this is what's going to create the dynamic platform so that we can then store and release elastic energy. So what is storing and releasing elastic energy? If we look at the posterior kinetic chain, there are four primary, I call them fascial springs. These are tendons of connective tissue that the musculature acts on so that the body can store and translate elastic energy. So if we look at, I call it the master spring, which is the lumbar dorsal fascia, this is where the core subsystem of the glutes and the latissimus dorsi are coiling into. As that energy is coiled into the lumbar fascia, it also has to act through the sacrum. So this is another way of looking at the sacroiliac joint is really the principal player here in how the action of these principal actions are acting on structure. We have four major fascial springs. We've got the lumbar dorsal fascia. We've got the iliotibial band. We've got the Achilles tendon, and we've got the plantar aponeurosis. So the iliotibial band, it stores its energy in the extension phase of the gait. Now, what happens when the hip flexors, which are the functional opposites, when the tensor fascia lata is unable to eccentrically lengthen, then the femur can't externally rotate and extend so that this can fully load. What happens when these fascial springs are unable to store and release elastic energy because the musculature around it isn't responding appropriately? There is going to be players in that musculature that will become overworked because it's going to be trying to do, they're going to be trying to do the job that the fascial spring was to be doing, but it's not able to do it. And so when we see overworked aspects of the structure, it's because of these fascial springs. Very interestingly, in our culture, which is a shoe-based culture, we see a lot of plantar fasciitis. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. For example, the foot mechanics could be off. And so the sensors in those joints aren't sending the messages to the musculature that acts on the toes and the metatarsals and the tarsal bones. And then those messages don't send appropriate information back to the muscles. Somebody has to compensate for that. Now, we also see problems with plantar fasciitis because the core, the lumbar dorsal fascia, all the compartments of the core musculature, from the abdominal core musculature, from how the appendicular skeleton ties into that abdominal core musculature, like the glutes, the lats, the obliques, all that musculature ties in directly to the lumbar dorsal fascia. If those muscles aren't responding appropriately, the lumbar dorsal fascia is going to be impaired in storing elastic energy. When that happens, muscles become overworked. Now, what will typically happen is you'll see that when we can't coil through the posterior spiral, we're then unable to translate into the anterior spiral. So these anterior spirals become overworked because they're not receiving the rebound energy that they need so that they can work more efficiently. And so the two principal actions for the last two kinetic chains, the spiral kinetic chains, are storing and releasing elastic energy. So what's happening here is that we have to store elastic energy. That has to be realized through the release of elastic energy into the complementary movement. And the gait, that would be push to swing. There's different ways that elastic energy will translate through our structure. And these are the various kinds of force transmission systems that we have. What we'll typically see when we're unable to coil effectively through the posterior chain and generate push is that the hip flexors will become overwhelmed and need to work harder. This becomes a two-edged sword, because when the hip flexors become overworked, that also impedes coiling. And so it's both happening, and then it's like becomes a rebound of reverberation of energy, and that energy then becomes more and more stuck, and tissues become more and more tight and less competent to work. And so where does this start then? It starts with looking at why can't the structure coil? It may be in the functional opposite. It may be in a joint or a ligament. When we start to look at assessment strategies of structure, that's a very different thing than looking at the assessment strategies of the nervous system, like when we were looking at the intrinsic kinetic chain. So what we want to do when we start looking at structure is looking at how joints are responding, because the joints are giving the information to the nervous system how the muscles are to act. And without that, the muscles are essentially the slaves. They're just doing the job of keeping the joints safe, right? This becomes the advanced work that we do in dynamic neuromuscular assessment, is we go through a progression. The progression is, how is the nervous system responding? How is the structure responding? How can we incrementally use movement to evaluate structural response. The other thing that we need to also look at is that we don't just walk. We have a relationship to sleep where we're lying down. We have ground engagement. We play with our kids. We have our sports and activities. All these have different relationships to how our structure needs to respond to movement. This is why understanding someone's proclivity to an activity and the different integrations and attributes that is required in that activity becomes a very important part of our assessment process. So just to recap, these 5 principal actions help inform us on our assessment strategy. We first want to make sure that we have this dynamic platform in place. That has to be in place so that we can then store and release elastic energy. Once we have a well-integrated dynamic platform, then we can start to work on the relationship of storing and releasing elastic energy. This becomes the process of moving from recovery, which might be prehab or rehab, to performance. Well, thanks a lot for tuning in, and in subsequent weeks, I'm going to go through the principal actions in more detail for each kinetic chain. Until then, have a great day. And again, we'll talk to you soon. And you can contact me if you have any questions about this at joseph@dna-assessment.com. And also, we have an upcoming DNA assessment seminar that's going to be in Philadelphia on the 21st and 22nd of February. And in that seminar, we're going to go very deep into the intrinsic kinetic chain and nervous system response. Hope to see you there. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Bye-bye.